Scientists often gather data through observation, experiments, archival studies, and so on. But they are rarely satisfied with data alone. Scientists want to draw conclusions from those data. They want to use the data to show that certain theories are right and others are wrong. To understand science, then, it will be important to understand when it is legitimate and when it is illegitimate to draw a specific conclusion from what we already know. We need to understand the difference between good and bad arguments. And that is why in this lecture we will take a look at logic, the study of argumentation. Let us first introduce some terminology. An argument consists of two parts, the premises and the conclusion. The premises are the things we presuppose, and the conclusion is what we conclude from those premises. So let's look at an example. No medieval king had absolute power over his subjects. Louis VII of France was a medieval king. So, Louis VII of France did not have absolute power over his subjects. Here the first two lines are the premises, and the final line, introduced by the word so, is the conclusion. In this argument we assume that medieval kings did not have absolute power and that Louis VII was a medieval king, and we conclude that he did not have absolute power. As a second piece of terminology, we will make a distinction between valid and invalid arguments. A valid argument is an argument in which the conclusion really follows from the premises. Our example about Louis VII is an example of a valid argument. The conclusion really follows from the premises. It makes sense to draw this conclusion from these premises. As an example of an invalid argument, we can take this. No medieval king had absolute power over his subjects. Louis VII of France was a great horseman. So, Louis VII of France did not have absolute power over his subjects. We just can't draw that conclusion from those premises. So this argument is not valid. It's invalid. Note that whether an argument is valid or not has nothing to do with whether the premises or the conclusions are true. Perhaps Louis VII really was a great horseman. Then all the premises and the conclusion of that argument are true, and yet the argument is invalid, because the conclusion just doesn't follow from the premises. On the other hand, it's also possible to have false premises and a valid argument. For instance, no medieval king had absolute power over his subjects. Victor Gijsbers was a medieval king, so Victor Gijsbers did not have absolute power over his subjects. This argument is perfectly valid, even though the assumption that I am a medieval king is, as far as I know, false. We can now introduce our final piece of terminology, the distinction between two kinds of arguments, deductive arguments and inductive arguments. A deductive argument is an argument in which the truth of the premises absolutely guarantees the truth of the conclusion. It's just not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false.